Doris had barely finished greeting a new tenant when the front doors of the warehouse slammed open. The entire reception area fell silent. Her mother, Margaret Carter, strode inside without hesitation, two attorneys at her side and her younger sister Vanessa following a few steps behind in designer heels. Margaret didn't even glance at the bustling offices, the busy cafe in the lobby, or the rows of employees working behind glass walls. She walked straight toward Doris as though she already owned the place. "You have 48 hours, Margaret said, placing a thick folder on the reception desk. "After that, this property belongs to your sister." The words echoed through the building. Several employees exchanged confused looks. A delivery driver stopped pushing his cart. Even the receptionist froze with her phone halfway to her ear. Doris stared at her mother. "Excuse me." "You heard me." Margaret folded her arms. "Your father made a mistake. Vanessa should have inherited this property from the beginning. Our attorneys are correcting it." Vanessa smiled as she slowly turned in a circle, admiring the polished concrete floors, exposed brick walls, modern offices, and crowded parking spaces. "I have to admit," she said, "you cleaned it up better than I expected." Doris felt something far colder than anger. It wasn't that her family had shown up. It was that somehow, they finally knew exactly what this warehouse had become. Margaret looked around with obvious satisfaction. "This building represents the Carter family now," she declared loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Vanessa is the one who belongs here. She knows how to manage successful properties. You don't." Doris didn't hesitate. "No." The single word stopped Margaret mid-step. "No," Margaret repeated. "I'm not giving you anything." Margaret's expression hardened. "I wasn't asking." One attorney quietly opened the folder and slid several legal documents across the counter. "We've filed a petition contesting your father's will," he said professionally. "You'll be formally notified today." For a brief moment, Doris couldn't hear anything else. Her eyes drifted across the busy warehouse, the same building everyone had laughed at years ago. The memory came rushing back. After their father's funeral, the family had gathered in his attorney's office for the reading of the will. Vanessa had received a luxury penthouse overlooking the city's waterfront. Gasps of admiration filled the room. Then the attorney turned to Doris. "And to Doris Carter. Your father leaves the warehouse located on Franklin Industrial Road, together with all existing debts, taxes, and associated obligations." Silence. Then came the whispers. "A warehouse. That's all." Someone actually laughed. Vanessa leaned over and squeezed Doris's hand with exaggerated sympathy. "I guess Dad figured somebody had to clean out the junk." Several relatives chuckled. Margaret didn't defend Doris. Instead, she sighed. "You should sell it immediately," she had said. "Take whatever someone offers before it costs you even more money." At the time, Doris had almost agreed. The warehouse had been abandoned for years. The roof leaked. Broken machinery filled every room. Windows were boarded shut. Outstanding property taxes had piled up. Owning it had felt less like receiving an inheritance and more like inheriting someone else's failure. Yet one memory had refused to leave her. The night before her father passed away, he had squeezed her hand with surprising strength. His voice had been barely above a whisper. "Doris." She leaned closer. "Don't let anyone convince you to sell." She had wanted to ask why. Instead, he simply smiled, closed his eyes, and never spoke again. Standing inside the thriving headquarters now, Doris finally understood why those words still echoed in her mind every single day. Outside the warehouse, a sleek black luxury SUV rolled slowly through the front gates. Vanessa had arrived expecting to inspect an abandoned industrial building. Instead, the parking lot was completely full. Employees walked between buildings, carrying laptops and coffee. Delivery trucks lined the loading docks. The old warehouse had become the center of an entire commercial campus. Vanessa stepped out of her vehicle. She looked up at the restored brick facade, bearing the polished steel sign. Carter Innovation Center. The confident smile disappeared from her face. She stood perfectly still. Completely frozen, Doris watched Vanessa standing speechless outside the warehouse windows before quietly turning away. For the first time in years, her younger sister looked genuinely unsettled. That expression carried Doris back to the day everything had begun. The attorney finished reading the will, and the room immediately erupted around Vanessa. "A waterfront penthouse," an uncle exclaimed. "Your father really wanted you taken care of." Relatives surrounded Vanessa with hugs and congratulations. Someone joked about housewarming parties. Another asked how much the apartment was worth. Doris stood alone, holding the folder that listed an abandoned warehouse, overdue taxes, and a building inspection filled with warnings. Margaret walked over, glanced at the paperwork, and shook her head. "Don't waste your time with that place," she said flatly. "Sell it for whatever you can get. At least you'll walk away with something." "I should at least see it first," Doris replied quietly. Margaret sighed. "You're always so sentimental." A week later, Doris unlocked the warehouse for the first time. The heavy metal door groaned open. Rainwater dripped through holes in the roof. Rust covered forgotten machines. Broken pallets and shattered glass littered the concrete floor. The building smelled of dust, oil, and years of neglect. She stood in silence before whispering, "What was Dad thinking?" For a long moment, she considered locking the door and calling a real estate agent. Instead, she picked up an old broom. While clearing the former office, she discovered several worn notebooks stacked neatly inside a cabinet. They weren't letters. They were maintenance journals written in her father's careful handwriting. Every page contained repairs, measurements, cost estimates, and practical advice about preserving the building. At the bottom of each notebook, the same sentence appeared: "Keep improving it." Nothing more. No explanation. No promise. Just those 3 words. Doris slipped the first notebook into her bag and returned the next evening. Then the evening after that. She worked after finishing her full-time job, spending weekends patching leaks, painting walls, repairing wiring, and learning skills she had never imagined needing. Whenever she wanted to quit, she reopened one of the notebooks. Keep improving it. Months slowly became years. One small workshop rented a corner. Then another. A furniture maker moved in. A coffee shop leased the front space. The warehouse gradually came back to life, but Doris never mentioned its progress during family gatherings. No one asked. No one cared. Until one morning, a certified envelope arrived at her office. She opened it. Her hands stopped moving as she read the first line. "You are hereby notified that Margaret Carter and Vanessa Carter have filed a petition to invalidate your inheritance." The courthouse hallway buzzed with whispers before Doris even entered the mediation room. Relatives who hadn't spoken to her in years suddenly had plenty to say. There she is. She's really going to fight her own family. I heard she manipulated her father before he died. Doris kept walking without responding. Inside the room, Margaret sat confidently beside Vanessa and their attorneys. The moment Doris took her seat, Margaret leaned forward. "You've embarrassed this family long enough," she said. "Sign the transfer papers and we can end this today." Doris met her mother's eyes. "I'm not signing away something Dad intentionally left to me." Vanessa scoffed. "You honestly expect everyone to believe Dad wanted you to have property that's now worth millions. You got lucky, that's all." Margaret nodded toward the mediator. "My late husband never intended this outcome. The warehouse only became valuable because the neighborhood changed. Doris is benefiting from circumstances she didn't create." Doris quietly opened a large binder. "May I respond?" The mediator nodded. One by one, Doris laid out years of renovation permits, contractor invoices, tax records, photographs documenting every stage of the restoration, tenant leases, and business licenses. "I paid every overdue tax," she said calmly. "I repaired the roof. I replaced the electrical system. I negotiated every lease. The neighborhood didn't build this business." The mediator carefully examined the documents. "This is extensive." Vanessa's confidence began to crack. She folded her arms and blurted out, "Well, I never even bothered visiting that warehouse until it was actually worth something." The room fell silent. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. An elderly family friend, Mr. Holloway, slowly stood. "I remember driving past that place for years," he said. "Every Saturday, Doris was there working alone. The rest of you called it a junkyard." No one answered him. For the first time, sympathy in the room shifted toward Doris. Margaret noticed it immediately. Her expression hardened. "You all think you've heard the whole story," she said, reaching into her briefcase. "Our family has new evidence." She removed a large sealed envelope and deliberately placed it on the attorney's table. "I believe this proves my husband intended Vanessa to inherit everything." Every eye in the room fixed on the unopened envelope. Doris barely slept after the mediation. The sealed envelope sat in her attorney's office like a ticking clock. If Margaret was telling the truth, everything Doris had spent years building could disappear with a single court ruling. The following morning, her attorney, James Ellison, spread the documents across a conference table. "This is what your mother calls her new evidence," he said. Doris leaned closer. It was an older draft of her father's will. In that version, nearly every major asset, including the warehouse, had been listed under Vanessa's name. Margaret folded her arms confidently. "There," she said, "he always intended Vanessa to inherit everything. The final version was obviously prepared by mistake." James remained silent, studying each page. After several minutes, he frowned. "Something doesn't add up." Margaret's smile faded slightly. "What do you mean?" James pointed toward the signature lines. "This draft was never executed." Doris looked closer. The spaces requiring her father's signature, 2 witnesses, and the notary public were all blank. "It isn't legally valid," James continued. "It's simply an unfinished draft." Margaret immediately interrupted. "It still proves his intentions." "No," James replied calmly. "It only proves someone considered different options before the final will was signed." For the first time since the lawsuit began, Margaret had no immediate response. The legal battle dragged on for several more weeks. While Margaret continued trying to pressure Doris into settling, something unexpected happened. Developers began calling. One after another. "We'd like to purchase your property. Our client is prepared to offer $23 million. We can close within 30 days. Every offer was higher than the last. Friends urged Doris to sell. "You've already won," one tenant told her. "Take the money." But every time she considered it, she remembered her father's final words. "Don't let anyone convince you to sell." She rejected every offer. When Margaret learned that Doris had refused tens of millions of dollars, she couldn't understand it. "You're being irrational," Margaret snapped during another meeting. "No," Doris answered quietly. "I'm trusting Dad." Days later, James called with unexpected news. "You need to come to my office immediately." When Doris arrived, an elderly gentleman was waiting. "I knew your father for almost 30 years, he said, extending his hand. "My name is Harold Benson." Doris recognized the name. Her father had mentioned him countless times. Harold slowly placed an old leather folder on the table. "I've stayed quiet because I assumed your family respected your father's wishes." He glanced toward the courthouse, visible through the office window. "I can see now I was wrong." James nodded. "What can you tell us?" Harold took a deep breath. "A few years before your father passed away, I accompanied him to several confidential redevelopment meetings. The city had approved a long-term plan to transform the entire industrial district. Doris stared at him. The warehouse was sitting at the center of it, Harold finished. He knew, Doris whispered. Harold nodded. He knew exactly what that property would become. Suddenly, every notebook, every repair, every instruction to keep improving the building, every warning never to sell, they all fit together. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had prepared her. Before Doris could speak, James's assistant hurried into the office carrying a file. "We've just heard from the estate attorney," she said breathlessly. "He located additional documents your father left in secure storage." James immediately stood. "If those documents are authentic, we need an emergency hearing." The courtroom was unusually crowded the following morning. Relatives filled the gallery. Vanessa sat confidently beside Margaret, convinced the older draft would still carry weight. Then the estate attorney entered. In his hands was a thick, sealed file bearing Doris's father's signature across the security seal. Even Margaret looked surprised. The judge accepted the file, carefully examined the seal, and opened it. He silently read the first few pages. Then he slowly looked up at everyone in the courtroom. The room became completely silent. Finally, the judge removed his glasses and said, "This document changes everything." The courtroom remained silent. No one moved. Margaret sat forward in her chair, gripping the edge of the table. Vanessa's confidence, which had carried her through every hearing, slowly gave way to uncertainty as the judge continued reading the newly opened file. After several moments, he looked toward the estate attorney. "Please explain how this document came into your possession." The attorney stood. "This file was prepared by Mr. Carter and me several months before his passing. Per his written instructions, it was to remain sealed unless anyone attempted to challenge the validity of his final will." Margaret's face lost its color. "There must be some mistake," she said. "There is no mistake," the attorney replied calmly. "Your husband anticipated this possibility." He handed a handwritten letter to the judge, who nodded before allowing it to be entered into the record. James turned toward Doris. "I think your father has been waiting years to answer this himself." The judge gave Doris permission to read the letter aloud. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. "My dear Doris, if you're reading this, it means someone has tried to convince the court that I made the wrong decision. I did not. You may believe I loved Vanessa more because I left her the penthouse. One day you'll understand that comfort isn't always the greatest gift. The warehouse was never worthless. Years ago, I learned that the industrial district would eventually become one of the city's largest redevelopment projects. I kept that information confidential because it wasn't public knowledge. I also knew my daughters. Vanessa has always preferred quick rewards. She would have sold the warehouse within weeks. You would stay. You would repair it. You would build something others couldn't see. That is why I trusted you with it." Doris paused, struggling to steady her voice before continuing. "I didn't leave you an old warehouse. I left you an opportunity. Real wealth doesn't come from receiving valuable things. It comes from creating value where others see none." Several people in the gallery lowered their heads. The room felt different now. Not because of the property's value, but because everyone finally understood why it had been left to Doris. The estate attorney then produced one final document. "This is the memorandum Mr. Carter referenced." The judge reviewed it carefully before speaking. "The language is clear." He looked directly at Margaret and Vanessa. "The warehouse cannot be transferred through family pressure, inheritance disputes, or legal reassignment. Ownership remains exclusively with Doris Carter unless she voluntarily chooses to sell or transfer the property herself." Margaret slowly stood. "He never told me." He wasn't required to, the judge replied. The court finds the final will valid and enforceable. He struck the gavel. The petition is dismissed. Margaret and Vanessa were ordered to pay the legal costs associated with the case. Their attempt to invalidate the will had failed completely. As people began leaving the courtroom, several relatives who had criticized Doris quietly approached her. "I'm sorry," one aunt said softly. "We believed the wrong story." Mr. Holloway, the elderly family friend who had defended her earlier, smiled. "I knew your father wasn't the kind of man to leave something important to chance." Vanessa remained seated. For the first time, she realized the luxury penthouse she had celebrated years earlier had steadily lost value, while the warehouse she mocked had become one of the city's most sought-after commercial properties. The inheritance she believed was unfair had never been unequal. It had simply required patience. A week later, Doris returned to the warehouse. Employees lined the entrance as she walked inside. Someone started clapping. Another joined in. Within seconds, the entire lobby echoed with applause. James smiled. "You didn't just protect a building. You protected everything you built." Over the following months, Doris expanded the property into a thriving innovation center where local entrepreneurs, small manufacturers, and growing businesses could lease affordable space. She restored one corner of the original warehouse exactly as her father had left it. His workbench, his worn tools, his maintenance journals. Visitors often stopped there before touring the modern facility. Many asked why she had preserved such an ordinary room. Doris would simply smile. "Because this is where everything truly started." Several months later, Margaret requested a private meeting. When they sat together, there were no lawyers, no court filings, no demands. "I was wrong," Margaret admitted quietly. "I thought your father had made a terrible mistake. I didn't understand what he saw in you." Doris listened without interrupting. "I can't change what happened," Margaret continued, "but I hope someday you'll forgive me." Doris looked through the cafe window toward the warehouse that had once been abandoned. "I don't carry anger anymore," she said calmly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the past never happened." Margaret nodded. She understood. When she left, neither woman looked back. Doris walked through the building one final time before locking up for the evening. The sunset reflected across the renovated brick walls. Employees laughed as they finished work. New tenants were preparing to move into recently completed spaces. The warehouse her family once called worthless had become a place where hundreds of people built their own futures. She paused beside her father's restored workbench and rested her hand on one of his old journals. Then she smiled and quietly said, "Dad didn't leave me an old building. He left me the chance to prove everyone wrong."